Welcome to the Stronger for Business podcast with Defrig Jenkins, Pete Rushmer, and myself, Bev Thorogood. Stronger for Business is a training consortium dedicated to bringing high-quality training solutions to businesses through the combined expertise of our partners. From skills training to developing personal and professional excellence, our mission is to help business owners get the very best from their people at all levels, from boardroom to shop floor. The Stronger for Business podcast is our opportunity to share our knowledge, thoughts and ideas with you, the listener. You'll get to meet some awesome guests from across the business world, sharing their experience of learning and development. If you love what we have to say, make sure you hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you use to consume your podcasts so you don't miss out on future episodes. We'd love to hear from you with your suggestions for discussion topics or ideas for future guests. And if you really love what you hear, please do consider leaving us a 5-star review, as this helps to get the podcast out to a wider audience. Sit back and enjoy the Stronger for Business podcast. This week with my lovely co-hosts Pete and Defrig, and we're actually going to be talking this week about feedback and the benefits of giving good feedback and the pitfalls of not getting great feedback. So before we get going, do you guys just want to say hello?
Hello everybody, thanks for coming back. And for those who have just started, thank you for
coming back.
Thanks for coming back, and also
thanks for listening.
Absolutely, we love having you here.
I have to say, we're a bit giddy this morning because I think this is about take number 5 because I got a fit of the giggles and realised I couldn't actually talk very well this morning. So what you been up to, guys? Take the pressure off me for a minute so I can compose myself. Duff, what you been up to this week?
So this week I have mostly been doing some virtual sessions this week. So like lots of people, we're kind of moving rapidly into the virtual space because it's here to stay for the future. So we've done some sessions this week. The feedback's been really cool. I've had a few conversations about some really interesting guests for future podcasts as well. So somebody that I used to work for a little while ago, and somebody in the States as well. So I think that's just a little flag for the future as well. So we're going to start recording with 2 amazing people. One who's a very senior business leader, HR leader, and another person who's gone through massive amounts of adversity and who lives in the States. But more about that in future podcasts. Yeah, really interesting, busy week. Yeah, what about you?
So the adversity isn't living in the States?
It's not living in the States.
Okay, just separating those 2 points out. Brilliant. No, I look forward to that. I know we're going to have some brilliant guests, and we've already had some really cool guests already, and I think going forward we're going to really reach out to some influential people and get some really good insights through the podcast. But for today, we'll stick with what Pete's got to say. What you've been up to?
Well, I've had a ridiculous week, to be honest. I feel absolutely shattered, which is great, and no, it's been absolutely fantastic. I've made offers to 2 new members of staff, a full-time and a part-time, which is really exciting. And we even made a return to classroom training this week as well. So yeah, lots of news from Flagship HQ.
Brilliant. Do you know, that's really encouraging, isn't it? When I read in the on the news this morning, the economy's dropped something like 20% following COVID. So to see you growing is it's music to my ears. I'm so pleased for you.
So I appreciate it.
For me, it's definitely things are turning, aren't they? They're turning a corner. I saw somebody else on LinkedIn yesterday has got back into the classroom and delivering face-to-face with adaptations, of course. But I think it's coming back, and I've had a couple of really interesting conversations this week with previous clients, 2 quite big contracts for me, wanting to look at future work and looking at blending. We talked about this last week, didn't we, on the podcast, looking at blending some e-learning, virtual learning with face-to-face stuff going forward. So that I feel like things are, what's the word they use, that phrase, green shoots, that it feels really like they're starting to come through now. So that's fantastic feedback, isn't it? Did you say what I did there? Did you say the segue there? So, so we were talking about what we were going to talk about today, and we came up with the idea of feedback. And I think it probably stems from a post I put on LinkedIn the other day about some feedback that I'd had from a previous boss. And I'm talking probably 20 years ago, where basically he bawled me out in front of about 7 people in the office and told me I was, he asked me actually, he even asked me, are you an absolute effing idiot, in front of everybody? Yeah, it was horrendous. And when I look back and think about it now, and I was quite timid, and I didn't say anything. I think I was in a bit of shock, really, because I'd never had anybody talk to me that way. And I, you know, when I think back to him, he was a bully, top and bottom. That, you know, that was the top and bottom of it. But his communication skills, shall we say, were on or off. As in, he was either yelling or he wasn't communicating at all. So most of us got what he wanted us to do wrong because we were scared to ask for clarification, and his communication skills were so poor that we didn't really know what he wanted anyway. Suffice to say, I lasted in that job about 7 weeks before I left. So I wasn't even, it's not even as if we'd had a long time to build up a relationship. It was literally, you know, 7 weeks in the job, and his feedback was shocking. But what was more shocking was nobody gave him feedback on his managerial skills. So he was a staff sergeant in the army, and I think whether that was the way he'd been sort of led through his career, was to bawl people out or belittle in front of everybody else. Whether he thought that was a sort of the best way to command and control, I don't know. But it certainly, as a civilian, it wasn't something I was used to. But nobody gave him any feedback as to his behaviour. So that's kind of where the conversation, I think, stemmed from for this week. But it is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to, you know, to use the term that you used, to bawl somebody out, that's not feedback. That's just stripping, you know, taking the strips off people. And I've had experiences in my career of amazing conversations and actually being given feedback when I didn't realize it was feedback. You know, it was very constructive, but I came away thinking, oh, I feel really good about that. Or I know what I've not done so well, because it was a conversation rather than a structured process or, you know, being yelled at. But I've also had experiences, you know, similar to you, Bev, where I've had people senior to me, again, you know, when I was in my 20s when I first started working, you have experiences where people would just yell at you. Thinking, well, and I was the same. You know, I grew up in South Wales. We're all quite direct with each other. But, you know, but it was just that kind of environment. Thinking that's no way to talk to somebody. I think, you know, there's my personal values in that as well. But I'm thinking you get so much more out of me if you just spoke to me with a little bit of respect, and just as another human being, really. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, I've certainly had my fair experience of bad feedback and badly skilled leaders with feedback. And I think it's actually quite a rare skill, especially, I think we can all give feedback, and whether that's good or bad, but it's a real skill to give it, to be able to deliver top quality developmental feedback. Top quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time people focus on the individual, they focus on a person's identity, and they give feedback around the identity. It's interesting, actually. So, as you know, sometimes I don't have to, but I choose to look after my 5-year-old granddaughter. And I had her this morning, she was getting ready for school. And I'd asked her to put her dress on. And 5 minutes later, she was doing something completely different. And I said to her, come on, Connie, stop messing around. Can you get your uniform on, please? And she sat down with her dress and she said, oh, I'm so lazy. And I said, no, you're not. You got distracted, but you're not lazy. She said, but I am lazy. And I thought, I don't know where this has come from. I said, no, you're not lazy. That's about who you are, and you're not lazy, because when you're motivated to do what you want to do, you do it. So it's, but I think often it just got me thinking about how people label themselves. So if you're given feedback at an identity level, you become the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when good feedback is given, it's given in the around the situation and the behavior. It's not about the identity. And I think that's a lot of the time where we mess up on giving feedback. We say you are or you did, as opposed to actually the you did is probably fine because that is about the behavior. But if you're giving feedback that suggests that a person that's the way the person is, well, that's not really very helpful, is it? Because most of the time we can't change the person we are. We can only change our behaviors.
Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting you give the example of your granddaughter because as you guys know, and some of the listeners might know as well. So my wife works in the childcare sector. She trained as a nanny, has been working with children and people who now support children for many, many years. And when we had our girls, she said you have to be quite careful about how you talk to them, because this is about the labeling that we have. So typically, a parent or guardian might say, you're very naughty. But the child isn't naughty, it's what they're doing in their behavior. A child isn't naughty, their personality isn't naughty, their behavior. We can't change our personality necessarily, but like you said, you can change or modify your behavior. And that's really, really important. So just on that topic, when I'm facilitating sessions on feedback, I usually have a conversation about, and I'll put up some labels, write them up on a flip chart on some post-its or whatever, and I'll ask people, which one of these describe behavior? So it could be overconfident or loud or kind or whatever it might be. And I ask, how many of these things actually describe behavior? And actually, it's a bit of a trick question because none of them do, because they're all labels of how we judge other people, because we've got our own perception filters and our own values and those kind of things as well. So we see people as being confident or loud or rude, but actually all of those things are labels, and it doesn't really address behavior. So that is one of the big first stumbling blocks. Is we need to educate ourselves as to actually what is it that they're really doing that contributes or hinders a situation or an interaction. It's really important.
So when thinking about our own experiences then, Pete, you've just mentioned that you've had lots of experiences of bad feedback. Yeah. Can we explore what that looked like for you? So what was the feedback, if you can remember examples, and how did it leave you feeling, and what would have worked better? 3 parts to that.
Wow, yeah, got you. So I think I know when I switch off to people, and I get a lot of people who and it's like natural problem solving. So rather than giving me developmental feedback where I go and reflect on that to be able to improve performance, I've often surrounded myself in the industries that I've worked in with you shoulders, I call them, and you should, and you should, and you should, or next time you should. And it's great that people want to share that, but that's then advice, isn't it? So it becomes advice rather than feedback. And that is something that I often find quite demotivating, because I will learn if I'm given feedback on how I've done rather than being told how it should be done differently. I think that's kind of a key sort of change there. And I think certainly with regards to giving feedback, I think it's something that is absolutely paramount that people in leadership roles where they carry out one-to-ones and appraisals, that they have training to be able to deliver good quality feedback. Because in my experience, I've certainly never had any formal training. In my personal development journey that I've embarked on myself, I've had evaluation feedback training via Toastmasters, but it's not something that I've had formalised even through various different training channels. So I think it's quite rare that people really focus on it, but it's so paramount in being able to engage people and motivate them to want to improve performance.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you said you should. It reminds me of the Harry Enfield character. I can't remember the name of the character. You don't want to do it like that. You want to do it like this. And I think, for me, good feedback has always been about me talking more than the person giving me the feedback, which seems a bit bizarre, doesn't it? Because if you're getting feedback, you'd think they'd be talking to you. But I don't know about you guys, but I absolutely always know when something I haven't done something very well. I actually don't need anybody to tell me I didn't do a good job, because generally speaking, I know. And the best feedback I think that I've ever had has been more around a coaching style, where somebody said to me, what do you think, what do you think of how you performed in that situation, whatever that might be? Tell me what you thought went well.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what you thought didn't go so well. And actually, I know it. And when it comes from me, I'm owning that feedback. I'm owning whatever needs to be done. And it might be that, and it has been that I've said what I thought didn't go very well, and that the person giving me the feedback has been able to chip in and say, yeah, I think, I would agree with that. And possibly also this. I noticed this could have gone differently. What might you do differently in the future? And it's very much about asking questions rather than giving the you shoulds.
Yeah, it's definitely a two-way. It should be a two-way conversation. An effective manager or peer or whoever, should go into that and think about it as a conversation rather than a difficult conversation, because sometimes we psych ourselves up to think, oh, this could be awkward, or there could be some conflict. And actually, that's all you need sometimes, is just to have a conversation about it. But it's the mindset that we have going into that conversation. And like I said, Bev, most people in the workplace are not terrorists. Most people don't go to work thinking, I'm going to do a bad job today. And intuitively, most people know when they've messed up. The last thing you want, especially when you're a conscientious employee, is knowing and then beating yourself up because you've messed up, and then somebody coming on and layering an extra lot of guilt or on top of that as well, because that will really make for a bad day. So it is better to have that conversation, and when the time is right, when you are in a place receptive to have that conversation, because that's really important as well. But also, and I've had times as well where, at home with the children or in the workplace as well, something's happened and it's really pushed the wrong button. That is not the time to give feedback. When you become cross, I've messed up loads of times in work, and if we're all honest, we've all messed up in work, and we will continue to mess up in the future. That's just life, and we just have to accept that of ourselves and other people as well. And people in my teams in the past, or people I've worked with, they've done some stuff, and I'm thinking, it's not disastrous by any stretch of the imagination, but thinking, why have you done that, or why have you done that again? But then I have to think, right, now is not the time, because I'm feeling a bit mad about it. I'm feeling a bit cross about it now. Now is not the time to have that conversation, because I might go off into the stratosphere because I'm cross about something. I need to be in the right state of mind, and that person who I want to have a conversation with needs to be in that right frame of mind as well. That's really important.
Absolutely. That's that emotional intelligence, isn't it? To have enough emotional intelligence to know that you need to be in control of your own emotional state, because otherwise you will be personal. It will be at the identity level. You'll just, unleash all of this anger or frustration or whatever it is that's in you. But I think that also that brings up the question of, when do you give feedback? And I think certainly if you're in a highly emotional state, then you're not going to be given feedback. You're just going to be bawling somebody out, and it's not going to work. But equally, how long do you wait before you give that feedback? Obviously, you've got to let your emotions calm down so you can be more objective and rational. But I think there's an awful lot of times when feedback isn't given quickly enough. It's a bit like, if your dog does something wrong, there's no point in going back 2 days later and rubbing their nose in it. It doesn't work. The moment has passed. So I guess the question is, how on earth do we figure out how long we wait before we give feedback for it to be optimal?
Yeah. I'm sorry if you just lost me a moment. I actually had to change internet connection because we're on a Zoom call here, and I literally, you guys just froze a minute and I couldn't hear anything. So if my if it went a bit waspy, apologies for that. I think you're absolutely right though, Bev. With feedback, it needs to be immediate. It needs to be there and then in the moment, because if it's left too long, it can be irrelevant. I think it's very important that it's timely. I've been guilty myself when I reflect on me giving feedback to people and my team, certainly in previous roles. I know that picked up on stuff and then raised it at a one-to-one, which is maybe a couple of weeks later, it's just not effective. It's not effective at all. It's much better to be able to have the confidence to go and have the conversation there and then. And I think it comes down to leadership confidence. I think it's down to preparation as well. One of the things that we hadn't mentioned that I think is really, really important is the language and the language we use, and personalising feedback. Certainly in the development I've had via Toastmasters, which I think is a fantastic organisation we were talking about just before we came online, and Toastmasters was absolutely fantastic for evaluation, because it gives the structure of a Toastmasters meeting is that you have speeches, and then half of that activity or that evening session is dedicated to giving evaluation and the quality of the evaluation, and then actually the evaluations get evaluated as well, and feedback gets given on those because of how important feedback is to getting great development and having great development opportunities. So a really good example with language is, you were very quiet. If someone's speaking, you were very quiet in comparison to selecting words like, I had difficulty hearing you, which just that subtle change in language, saying I had difficulty hearing you, is personal to me. It's my experience. I had difficulty hearing you. But that then gives you the opportunity to go, oh, okay, I know that I need to improve next time. You have the opportunity to make the decision of what happens next.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. You've got to make feedback about the impact it has, as opposed to the failing almost. So what you're saying there is, this is the impact that you had on me, and it probably wasn't the impact you wanted to have, and that's really helpful feedback.
Yeah. Context in the feedback is so important. So going back to what you said earlier, Pete, the ideal scenario. So I know you used the word immediately, but I know you said it's timely, and often guidance on feedback is around timely feedback. But then, that is quite a grey statement, because timely to me might be different to somebody else, because you have different concepts of time. So I think, immediate, with the caveat of we both need, the person giving and the person receiving that feedback their mental state needs to be balanced, if you like. But how timely. So for some people, if it happens at the end of the day, as an example, end of a working day, do you give it that feedback to the person before they go home, or do you have a conversation with them first thing in the morning the next day? But it just, sometimes, people have had a really, really hard day at work, and the last thing they want is some developmental feedback. But as the line manager, you still have to give them that feedback, because that's your responsibility as a line manager to help that person reduce a blind spot or raise their personal awareness, or whatever it might be, or maintain standards, safety even. So it needs to be timely. But what, given in that context that we're just talking about, it's really helpful sometimes to be really clear when you say to somebody, and sometimes to say, can I give you some feedback, or do you mind if I give you some feedback? I might maybe not even use the word feedback, because often somebody used to say to you, can I give you some feedback? It's almost like the headmaster's talking to you. I'm going to give you criticism, yeah. And criticism in its true sense is, it's a conversation, it's my view, but we see criticism in common language of being critical or being negative, if you like. So if you say, can I have a quick chat, or can we have a conversation about what happened just then? Like Pete said, it's about subtleties in the language, but because sometimes what happens is, I really want to give you some feedback. What's going to happen is the shutters are going to come down, because people expect, because most of us have a poor experience of feedback or developmental conversations rather than positive. So if we were to say, can I have a conversation with you, and then be really specific, so you can say, so I heard you on that call earlier to that customer, and what I heard was, not what, like Pete said, not what you did, but what I heard was that you were quite short, and I heard you say, and you be very specific about the words, not saying you were rude to that customer, because that's my judgment of that, specifically what they did. So you shouted, you used some inappropriate language with that customer. Now, the effect that had on me was, I feel unsure about the quality of the customer experience, or the consistency of customer experience that you are giving to our customers. So it's what you see. So you're very specific about what happened, when it happened, the behavior that you saw displayed or not being displayed, and then the impact it had on you. Now, you don't know in that example the impact it had on that customer. That customer could have been really fine about that, probably not. It's the impact that you had as the line manager, because you might be concerned about quality or standards or something like that. And then we can open it up to a conversation and say, go back to what you were saying earlier, Bev. So what could you do better next time? Or how do you think that customer might have felt on you? Then essentially you open up a coaching conversation off the back of that, rather than like Peter was saying earlier with previous examples, like, why did you do that? Don't do that. You need to be more constructive with your customers next time.
Yeah, no, I think that
longer,
specificity.
It takes longer to have that conversation, but it has a longer, more beneficial effect.
Yeah, it has way more impact, doesn't it? Much more impactful.
Mm-hmm.
I think as well, I'm sure you both are familiar with transactional analysis. I think there's a danger when we give feedback that we take a parent-child approach, especially if we're a manager giving feedback. And actually, what does it feel like when you're being told off as a child? You feel, you feel undermined, you feel silly, you feel, chastised, possibly angry, rebellious maybe. Where actually, if you can get that adult transaction where you're talking to each other on a level, but that doesn't happen in one conversation. That has to be built over time with a relationship that you have with your colleagues. And I think the other thing with feedback, I think, is if you want to give developmental feedback rather than negative feedback, let's call it developmental feedback, it can't be all about the negative. It can't be all about the bad stuff. You've got, feedback should be a natural part of everyday communication. So it needs to be a proactive process rather than a reactive one. So, if you're regularly receiving good feedback on what's going well, you're much more receptive and trusting of the feedback about something that isn't going well, because it's not a one-way street. You're not just hearing the bad stuff, you're hearing the good stuff as well. What I was interested in was, I read something a couple of days ago that said negative feedback in private, positive feedback in public. And I don't think I totally agree with that. I think you've got to look at knowing your people and what are they motivated by. Now, for me, public praise that's good for me. I like recognition, and that works with my personality. But I know I've worked with people who, if I gave them public recognition, they'd be mortified. I wouldn't give them negative public feedback either, but I don't think it is a case of, positive in public, negative in private. What are your thoughts?
I've got really clear views on this. As you can see, this is one of my favorite subjects, because I've seen it done well and I've seen it done badly, as we've said already, and I've seen the effects of that have on people as well as teams. If I can we just talk about the kind of the traditional labels around feedback? So I've heard a lot of people saying, I like to give constructive feedback. I said, okay, but shouldn't all feedback be constructive? Yeah, I'd like to give some positive feedback. Or I've given my team some negative feedback before. What do you mean by negative? Can you imagine if you're sat down with a line manager and say, I'm going to give you some negative feedback? Great, whoo, I'm really going to look forward to this conversation. It makes no sense to labeling it with that. One of the terms I prefer to use, and I'm not completely wedded to this, is just one. And it's created by an organization called the Center for Creative Leadership. So they're a global organization, not for profit. And they tend to use the words motivational and developmental. Now, you can use whatever words you want to, but essentially they talk about motivational and development, and that is around what most people might call praise, if you like. So you've done something well, or you've treated a customer really well, whatever it might be, and then you give some feedback around that. And that still needs to talk about what they did, what they didn't do, the effect it had on the customers and the impact, all those kind of things. But also the developmental feedback is what people call negative feedback, if you like. But the idea of giving that feedback is to help that person get better. So you're either maintaining already good performance or you want to improve performance. And that's going back to the question that we talk about a lot of the time, is that why, what is the purpose of feedback as well? So the two purposes of feedback is you already want to maintain already really good performance, or you want to improve somebody's performance, because as the line manager or business owner, that's your responsibility. And like you're saying, Bev, earlier, if you create a culture, if you like, or a working environment where feedback happens from day one. So, Pete, you've got new starters coming in potentially soon. if you start that kind of conversation, well, I'm always going to give you feedback, but the intent is always to help you. Yeah, people are much more receptive to that. Rather than 3 months down the line, worst case scenario, you come to the end of your probation period and somebody says to me, actually, we're going to let you go because you're not very good. Actually, the failing is not the individual, the failing is on the employer or the boss.
Yes. Yeah, I think I'm going to take a slightly contrarian view, and I know you said you weren't wedded to the idea, and I totally agree with motivational and motivational feedback and developmental feedback as a premise. Totally agree with it. I think the whole goal is to actually get the relationships to a level where it can almost be without any BS at all. So I call it, and something I've had before is what's called the BS sandwich. So something positive, something negative, something positive, and I just see straight through it. I'm like, right, just cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Like what,
Yeah.
like what's going on here? And sometimes, like one of the things, and I think it's probably just to add to the point you made, because it is important that we use the right language, but actually to have a relationship with people where you can go, do you know what? I respect your credibility and I completely respect your intelligence. So I'm just going to say how it is. And sometimes it's good to have that relationship with people too. And obviously it depends on the demographics and what situation you're in as to where that can be. But I believe we're in a position. So us three are in an advanced relationship. We give each other feedback. We speak regularly, and we can go, do you know what? I'm just going to say it, because actually sometimes that's even better, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think there's a danger with feedback that it's fluffy, and fluffy feedback is no good to anybody. You know, it needs to be straight talk. But I don't think you can go straight into a relationship with straight talk if you've not built up any kind of trust and rapport. And certainly from an NLP point of view, we talk a lot about building rapport and getting into rapport with somebody and speaking in their language. So, you know, I'm an SDI facilitator as well, and a lot of that is about communicating in the language of the person that you're talking to. So if you've got somebody who is, you know, motivated by people, you know, their relationship, giving them feedback that in any way sort of makes them question their motivation to develop relationships, it's going to possibly put their defenses up straight away. You've got to kind of understand and build that rapport. And I think if you've got that really good rapport, yes, you can be very straight, but I think again that straight talking, no BS conversation can only happen if you've built up trust, and it's not all about telling somebody they've done something wrong or something's not right. You have to be straight talking about the stuff they do well as well.
Yes.
And going back to your feedback sandwich, which I hate, and I've heard it in lots of things. So,
and it's still out there. It
is. Yeah, and the worst thing, the thing that makes that whole process even worse is but.
Yeah.
You did great. This was brilliant. This was brilliant. This was brilliant. But because you don't hear anything before the but. The only bit you focus on is the but. It's probably not what I meant to say.
I've got the old saying where I've been before, and that is everything before but is BS.
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
It's sugarcoating, isn't it?
But it's, you know, because and it's sort of respecting someone's credibility, and I think it's easy when you're in a small team, isn't it? Because you can build rapport, lots of positive feedback over time. And then when something goes wrong, you can just be almost like straight to the point with people, because you've got that, they know you see them as an equal, and it's not about a one-upmanship. It's not about anything else other than, do you know what, we're on the same team, we're on the same goal. Let's just get this right. However, absolutely, I think you need all the intricacies and the use of language and giving great feedback, positive and negative, all the way through a relationship to be able to get to that point.
I think so.
I think it's also a point where, you know, understanding your company values is really important. If you're allowing behaviors to continue that go against company values and you're not doing anything about it, it's very hard then to give feedback that's of any benefit. You know, if where am I going with this? if you're trying to give feedback on somebody's performance and it's out of alignment with the company values, then actually using those values as the basis for drawing the feedback, or drawing the behavior back to what's expected is great, and we should be using them, having clear values and living by them. But I've seen so many times in the past, in during my working life, where the bad behavior or poor behavior has been allowed to continue against the values, not in alignment with the values. And then when the feedback's been given, it has no meaning because it's been allowed to go on for so long. Did you follow where I was going with that? I kind of waffled a little bit.
I agree. And this is really important, for people who are not just line managers, but leaders or business owners as well. You have to role model what you see. I can't remember, somebody said you have to become the change you want to see. Might have been Gandhi, might have been paraphrasing that quote. But essentially, you have to role model that. So we've got a set of values that the three of us have agreed. And you're right there, for people who are maybe a little bit more timid when it comes to giving feedback, it gives you something, it's a bit like a crutch, if you like, because, you can say, as a company or as an organization, as a team, this is what we aspire to be. So what I've seen in the situation, and then you talk about the situation and you give the feedback around that. So it is like a bit of a crutch, and it gives you a bit more validity sometimes for the people who are less comfortable or less confident giving that feedback. And I've seen in organizations, in large organizations as well, where sometimes with some individuals, their behaviors go completely against, almost consistently, the values of that organization. But because technically they're very good at their job, they get away with it. And nobody wants to give that feedback to that individual. We have to remember, as people who have been or are senior people in our organizations, not everybody wants to give us feedback because we are the boss or the boss's boss or the head of department or the director or whoever it might be. So there's two things there. I think we need to be consistently role modeling the behaviors, because it's very hard to give people feedback about their behavior if we do that ourselves or we're not consistent ourselves, which sets, so that's added pressure for the leader to do that, because we have to be thinking about how we come across a lot as well. But also as well, we need to be receptive to feedback. So going back to what we said earlier, feedback is a two-way process. So don't expect to be able to give feedback if you're not prepared to take it yourself. And remember as well, people who are less experienced or less confident or maybe junior to you in the organization might not be as skilled at giving that feedback as well, but it's about the intention as well. And that's something really important. So, it's creating that environment where, as the leader or the owner, whoever, I want you to give me feedback, because otherwise I can't learn without it as well. I can't help develop our working relationship if I'm not receptive to feedback. Yeah. So, and that's really important. That's one of the first conversations we should be having with our teams or new team members too.
I think as a leader, I think leaders have to be very aware of the shadow they cast, mm-hmm. and that often they won't get the feedback that they need, and actually look for feedback, because feedback is in everything, whether it's in our body language or in the face we pull, and I know sometimes that's an assumption, but I think if we're very wary and self-aware, the more self-aware or emotionally intelligent we are, that we can almost ask people specifically, I noticed that was your reaction. Is that, when you look for feedback, I'm just looking for some feedback, I noticed your reaction and you seem dissatisfied with that. Can we have a conversation about that? And then sort of opening it up, because I think you've got to be proactive in looking for the feedback, because it may not be forthcoming because of the shadow you cast.
Yeah.
They talk about psychological safety, don't they? Creating a psychologically safe environment where people feel safe to make mistakes, feel safe to mess up. And I don't think if you are in an environment where you don't feel psychologically safe, then feedback is going to be very difficult to give or receive, because there's always this fear in your mind that you're going to be torn a strip off you because you've messed up. So I think creating an environment where it's all right to mess up, it's all right to get things wrong, it helps to kind of develop that whole feedback environment where it's all seen as constructive.
Absolutely, because without feedback there is no development. because we are blind. We all have blind spots. Just like, even as we get older, there's some behaviors that we will do repeatedly because that's how we are. It's not an excuse, but we can keep on working on that. But we only realize that when people flag that up, and sometimes it's a bit too late. It's a really interesting point, Pete, that you made earlier is recognizing, sometimes you get that twitch, don't you? And in somebody else's facial reaction or body language, we instantly know that that's happening, because our unconscious brain has picked up on that signal straight away, and we notice it. But then we have a choice. It's that kind of that moment of truth thing. Do we do something about that, or do we let it go? But if we've noticed it, then we shouldn't let it go, and it is absolutely worth that conversation. I noticed when I said this, you look really unhappy with that, the example, and they just have that conversation. Otherwise, we're never going to learn. And it might just be that thing just with that one individual, whereas the rest of the team might be okay with it. But, a team is a group of individuals. So it's really important that we're constantly trying to reduce our blind spots around our own behavior and skills.
Don't you use sorry, Pete. You go ahead, because I'm going to chat. Moving on to something else.
So I think one of the things I just wanted to sort of underline the point you've just made, Dov, which is totally valid, is about not making the assumption of what the reaction is, though, as well. And when you word that, because that is even more important that we get the language right on how we ask for that feedback, isn't it? Because it can almost be accusatory, I saw you did this, and all of a sudden it's like back foot, like, oh no, I've dropped it. But actually, we're making an assumption that it's negative. It might not be, or it might be. We can't be presumptive over what that may be. It could be anything about how that person has processed what we've said. And we've got to be totally open. But again, it fits in. I think the overarching point is about the culture we've created, isn't it, of openness and transparency and honesty and what have you. And all of this is much easier when that's present. Yeah. Sorry, Beth.
No, it's fine. Going on from what you said, I think there's also the fact that if we focus on solutions and not on the issue, that makes feedback a lot easier as well. So it's not about pointing the finger at what went wrong. It's more about asking, okay, so this didn't work too well. What are we going to do about it? What ideas have you got to going forward? And I think people are much more receptive to, okay, how could I put this right, than finger pointing. I heard a brilliant story. And I wish I could remember who it was attributed to, but it was something like, let's pretend it was Henry Ford, because he gets credit for everything. But it was something like he'd employed a finance director as part of his board, and the finance director, in the first 6 months of being there, had lost a huge amount of money. He'd literally made a mistake, made a bad judgment, and cost the company, in today's money, the equivalent of thousands and thousands, probably millions of dollars. And the rest of the board were kind of, clawing for revenge, almost like, let's get rid of him, he's got to be sacked, he's got to go. And Henry Ford, sorry if it's not you, basically sat there and said, I'm not going to fire him. I've just spent however many millions teaching him, training him. And it's about that sort of, look, let's not blame, let's look at what you've learned and what we can do going forward. That's just kind of an aside, really. A story with totally no truth in it. I'm sure there's a truth somewhere.
I don't know, but I love that mentality. That mentality is totally right, isn't it?
There's a reason why people fail, and sometimes just the culture and the environment and the other people.
Yeah, but also he could have brought in a different finance director who'd make exactly the same mistake and cost them a whole load more. But I bet that other guy would never make that same mistake twice. Now, what I was going to ask you was, don't you use a 360-degree feedback tool when you're coaching? Have I picked up on something? No. Can you talk us through that?
That is a true story.
Yeah, I don't always laugh.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so I partner with an organisation called Create People Inside. So they're a global organisation, and there's loads of assessments for managers and leaders, and it is a very, at the risk of sounding like sales pitch, it is a tool that people can tailor to individual needs, but also to cultural needs as well.
How does it look? How does it work?
So essentially, the way that it works is I'd have a conversation with a sponsor. So typically that would be a HR director, or operations director, or somebody in an organisation. We talk about the needs of the individual, or the business, or the team. There's a whole list of behaviours that might want to get measured. So it could be something like resilience or leadership or communication or dealing with conflict or whatever it might be. And then we'd create a tailored report for that individual or for that team. And then in the respect of a 360, typically then what you get is, if you're maybe a first level line manager, so supervisor kind of team leader level, then what you do then is to choose a few direct reports, so a couple of people working for them, a couple of people working at a peer level, and the boss, and maybe the boss's boss as well. And we could maybe choose then to, if it's applicable, maybe some customers or some suppliers or partners as well. So the idea is then that people provide a score through an online tool. It's very easy to use, but also what's really important then is that you get verbatim comments as well. So it's commentary, as we, whether that's verbal or written, it's the descriptions of how effective or maybe ineffective, if that's the right word, somebody is around that. And it can be really straightforward, and it's very cost effective because, like Pete said earlier, it's about the sustainability of feedback as well. But it gives somebody something really tangible, and off the back of that, then you can create a development plan off the back of that, and then really good coaching conversations and stuff as well. So there are loads of tools available, but 360, it's like everything, when it's tailored and when it's done well, and people get the feedback off the back of that, so they're really clear on what they need to do to maintain their level of achievement or to improve in specific areas. But that's when it becomes really valuable.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I've had a 360 before, and just to add weight to what you're saying, Duff, and not sound like a sales pitch, it was really valuable. It was really, really valuable. I got feedback from shop floor level through to senior management, and it was sort of categorized by their perception of my performance. Fantastic feedback.
So that's 180 feedback. I get that. Where does the 360 bit come?
I think because it's upwards, downwards, and then customers, suppliers. So you've got sort of kind of like a full circle.
And importantly as well, which I didn't mention, you get to rate yourself. So you rate yourself against the competencies or behaviors, whatever you're managing. So then you get your score, and then you get, as Pete said, so that you can see what your two levels up think of you, their opinion, your line manager. And what's sometimes interesting is that you get quite a difference between what the boss says as opposed to what your team says. There might be different perspectives. So the boss might rate you really highly on something, but your team might score you really low on something. And then that is a very useful conversation. And then some people might be a little bit apprehensive or scared or worried about that. But then that allows then a really good coaching conversation on the back. So what's going on? Why is there a different perspective? And that's when it becomes really useful, because then you have a really good concept, or you can have a really good conversation about that.
It sounds really good.
What I would never do is just give somebody a report. So there you go. That's your report. I think it's deconstructive. That's really unhelpful.
And that brings me on actually some of the worst sort of appraisal interviews and things like that I've had, where I've been told I need to improve on an area, because I think sometimes as well, and there's always room for development, but sometimes I used to get the feeling that my manager had gone into this interview desperately finding something to pick fault with. So there was no structure, there was nothing sort of specific about it, but they'd tell me I needed to improve, but wouldn't really give me any guidance on how to improve. It was just like, well, if I'm not getting it right, I don't know what to do to get it right. It was like they were abdicating responsibility for actually helping me to progress. And whilst you shouldn't necessarily be going, you should do it this way, there was no guidance either. When I was younger, you don't know, do you? You're kind of guessing most of the time. But yes, that's it. That's really, really just my reflection of poor feedback from my youth.
I don't know about your experience, but and I'm not going to mention names because it's unfair, but personal business plan where you sort of have your annual review, and it'd get graded by sort of didn't meet required standards, met required standards, or mostly met, performed above standards or way above standards. And then even your pay review was then accordingly, dependent on the percentage of uplift as well. To any big companies that are listening, make sure the line managers have the conversation before those grades get released.
Yes.
And you find out what grade you are.
Yeah.
Make sure the processes are in place, right?
We had a really strange performance appraisal system in the latter days of my MOD days. They basically, you were on a numerical score, so your appraisal was scored, and if you were in the top 5% across the board, it was a relative score across the board. If you're in the top 5%, you got a pay award, you got a bonus, a one-off pay bonus. But if you were in the bottom 10%, you were immediately put on to performance measures. But also, I remember reading the sort of the criteria for the appraisal system, and anybody going into the bottom 10%, being put in the 10%, the way it was worded was requires development. And I remember looking at it and thinking, that suggests that only 10% of the whole of the Ministry of Defence population need development. Everybody needs an element of development, even if you're at the top, in that top 1%. And it was really strange, because it seemed to me that the whole focus was put on the people who were in the bottom, who were performing the least well. So if that's the case, and that's where all the effort is, what about the people who were performing well? What about their motivation, and what about what feedback are they getting in terms of development to help them progress? It just seemed like a really, for my simple mind, a very strange way to assess people.
Strange language, yeah. And I suppose that's one of the final thoughts, if you like, of this podcast is the feedback should be a proactive thing. It should be something that we're doing all of the time. Yes, it can be reactive, but same as coaching or performance management, performance development, feedback is not a reactive thing. It shouldn't just happen when people mess up. When people are messing, whether it's the bottom 5%, 10%, there's a reason why those people are underperforming. And it might be down to their own behavior or lack of skill. They might just be a bad hire into that organization. All organizations, everybody makes mistakes. But there's also a reason why some people are underperforming. And sometimes that's down to the line manager of the culture that organization is working in at the moment. So yeah, proactive feedback all the time. You can't help all of the people, but you can definitely help most of the people. It's a really interesting observation where the language is, if you're underperforming, then you get development. That's like not having a safety net. If you're doing the, what's it called in the circus? Trampoline. Trapeze. Yeah, most people in the right mind wouldn't go on a trapeze without a safety net. So why, as an organisation, have you not got a safety net for these people? Really interesting.
Well, what was really interesting is that even if everybody, and it wouldn't happen in reality, but theoretically, if everybody was performing at an acceptable and satisfactory standard, there would still be a class of 10%, an element of 10%, because they were at the bottom, would be seen as underperforming, even if in reality they weren't. It was the most bizarre system. Anyway, guys, that is us up to the hour, and once again it's flown by, and I think there's some really valuable stuff gone on in there. I think next week we've got a guest. I'm not going to give away who it is yet, but I love our chats, but I do love it when we get a good guest as well. So just very quickly then, let's do our quick, what have you learned this week? Dove, any learning insights for you?
Yes, I've learned about GDPR this week. I'm having a conversation with a GDPR specialist who's I thought I knew not everything, but as much as I needed to know. Oh my God, it's actually quite painful. I've learned about how tricky GDPR is, even just about basic email communication with customers and just your general network. It is a bit of a minefield. I absolutely agree with why it's there. I think it's really important, but I've learned proactively, not reactively, about GDPR. So I'm having part of my professional development on Monday, a session about GDPR and what I can't and can't do, because I don't want to fall short of the law, but also I don't want to be annoying or upsetting my customers or potential customers.
And you don't want that fine. They're quite big fines now, aren't they?
£5,000, yeah, easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Pete.
So my learning is probably a bit more of a reinforcement this week, but following on from our conversation last week around face-to-face training and certainly virtual training and price point, I would like to just say that if we look to partner with the other stakeholders in our business and our clients, I spent a lot of time thinking about restructuring our pricing model, and I did it, and it's resulted in increased pricing, but also increased value for our clients. And it's been widely accepted this week by all of our clients. So I just wanted to sort of raise that if people are self-employed and thinking about it, as long as you put the case together and explain clearly why that's the case, stakeholders will engage.
Brilliant. Learning for me has been very much around practical stuff, really, different ways of delivering virtual training. I was introduced to something called OBS, which is it's a plugin really for people who do live streaming, but it means that you can kind of enhance your virtual presentations with sort of an overlay of different things that you can do. So it's very much been sort of practical, techie type stuff that I've learned. So I've also learned I need to go and do a bit of exploring, because it's like anything new, isn't it? You don't know what it does. I've got an idea of the sorts of things it can do, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a treasure chest of different things that I can learn to use in virtual presenting, because I think initially I was quite nervous about the whole virtual learning thing, and all I was doing really, I think we touched on this last week, was picking up my offline stuff and sticking it online, whereas I think there's a whole skill set to be explored, a whole new skill set. So that's kind of where my learning has been. So anyway, guys, another fabulous conversation. I might stick the outtakes on YouTube because it took us quite a while to get going this morning. But other than that, have a great weekend. Hope everybody will join us next Friday when our next episode comes out. And have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Speak soon. Take care.
Okay, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Stronger for Business podcast. A final thought before we go. In the words of Henry Ford, anyone who stops learning is old, whether at 20 or 80. Anyone who keeps learning stays young. So stay young and join us next Friday for our next episode of the Stronger for Business podcast.